Hello everyone and welcome. Sorry to disappoint you if you're expecting anybody else, but I hope I'm happy that you've joined us. This is a resumption of the briefings that we've been having from this office. So I'll start off by the obvious with the PM Abiy Ahmed's being at the front. It has been 1 week since Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who's also Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, has headed to the front lines to lead the troops. This move by the Prime Minister has been grossly misrepresented by some in the West that continue to grapple with the context that is unfolding in Ethiopia. To begin with, the decision to lead the troops from the front is not an escalation. Rather, it's a constitutional responsibility to preserve and ensure state cohesion, which the Prime Minister is tasked with. We have seen over the past months that the terrorist organization has been escalating and expanding the conflict into 2 other regions. Moreover, their members, based in the US, have openly declared efforts to overthrow a democratically elected government by force. Relatedly, the same individuals based in the US leading treasonous efforts to topple an elected government violently have also been in discussions with former and current Western diplomats, conspiring in a leaked video to overthrow the government. With these overt sinister schemes at regime change and attempts at an unconstitutional change of government, the Ethiopian Defense Forces have launched a counter-offensive on the terrorist organization, and the Prime Minister is now leading this from the front. His decision to join the army in the battlefield does not mean a change on the government's principled position of a peaceful solution to this conflict. Rather, averting the conspiracy of terrorist organizations working in collaboration with their foreign allies is a threat to the constitutional order of the state. His decision has inevitably boosted troop morale and emboldened the people of Ethiopia to unite and to resist and to push back the threat of the terrorist organization. In the past few days alone, great strides have been made in forcing the TPLF to relinquish their occupation of key areas, particularly Kasagita, Chifra, Burqa, and the advance on the Mile front in the Afar region by the terrorist forces, which was aimed at choking off the entire country from the main corridor for goods entering into the country, has also successfully been thwarted, with further advances being made by government forces as we speak. The Prime Minister has also made a call today, if you note, this call is being made to TPLF fighters to surrender peacefully and end the needless loss of a generation of Tigrayan youth, which are being driven into the forefront by the TPLF. This call is also an extension of the several similar calls that have been made by the federal government early in the conflict, if you recall, and is aimed at halting further bloodshed. To the second point that I'd like to share with you today is in terms of the state of emergency gains. It has been about 3 weeks since the enactment of the nationwide state of emergency. As has been shared several times, the state of emergency has been put in place as a preventive measure for sinister actions planned by the terrorist organization in Addis Ababa as well as other parts of the country. The proclamation has been enacted to avert the threat against the national existence and sovereignty, considering the scale of the killings, the looting, and other cruel and humane attacks that have been perpetrated by the terrorist organization as well as its affiliates in predominantly the northern part of the country as well as other pockets. So the state of emergency thus far has been highly effective in foiling the plan of the terrorist groups who have tentacles embedded within civilian populations and are working with foreign powers to weaken and destroy Ethiopia. Just to give you an example of how effective the state of emergency has been, so far through searches undertaken, small arms and light weapons, combat communication equipment, uniforms stolen from the armed forces and federal forces, and federal police, fake ID cards, foreign passports, counterfeit currency, foreign and local currency beyond legal limits have been seized in these searches by the security apparatus. So this small example gives the extent of organizing that the terrorist group has been undertaking through its networks to continue undertaking these heinous crimes throughout the country, but which are being foiled and thwarted. Moving to the third point in terms of sharing with you the humanitarian response update in the northern part of the country. Just to share with you some recent data that has been received from the National Disaster Risk Management Commission. In the Amhara region, as per the Regional Emergency Coordination Committee report, the escalation of the conflict by the TPLF into the Amhara region has displaced more than 1.1 million people in the region. The IDPs are mainly from Wagamra, North Gondar, South Gondar, Central Gondar, North Wallo, South Wallo, North Showa zones of the region, and Walqaita Zagade. Currently, at the Amhara regional level, more than 5.6 million people have been affected by the conflict, and emergency food assistance by the government, partners, local community, as well as private sector actors is being facilitated. In the Afar region, the affected population is estimated at more than 260,000, and displaced persons at more than 100,000. Nevertheless, this data will no doubt increase, considering the attacks of the TPLF that had been waged on the people of Afar in the past couple of weeks. So we will see probably a revision of these figures in that regard. With regards to provision of support in the region, the federal government, the National Disaster Risk Management Commission, together with regional counterpart and partners, are mobilizing resources for the IDPs in the region. As of October 21, 2021, and the government of Ethiopian partners have distributed over 36,000 quintals of food for more than 235,000 displaced people. The food consists of wheat, rice, pulse, oil, and wheat. And Regional Health Bureau is deploying mobile health teams in conflict-affected waradas and IDP sites. Specifically to humanitarian assistance within the Tigray region, since November 23, the United Nations UN Humanitarian Air Service flights to Mekelle have resumed. Humanitarian partners were able to rotate their staff in and out of Tigray and transfer operational cash to the region. Since then, 2 rounds of flights have been conducted. Through UNHAS flights, 19 partners transported an estimated Ethiopian bir 40 million to Mekelle for the administration and program budgetary expenditures. 353 trucks with humanitarian supplies are currently headed to the Tigray regional state from Samara through Abala Road, carrying more than 9,600 metric tons of food and 1,680 metric tons of non-food items. And a total of 116 trucks have already reached Mekelle town over the past few days. From July to October alone, the National Disaster Risk Management Commission has facilitated humanitarian cargo movement through Samara to Abala corridor. In total, up to 1,114 trucks have been deployed to the Tigray regional state to deploy humanitarian cargo from Samara to Mekelle through the Abala corridor, and only 322 trucks have been returned. So those trucks are still unaccounted for, but we know where we're seeing those trucks popping up. On current peace and security situation in the country, there is no doubt that Ethiopia is engaged in conflict with a belligerent terrorist organization that is employing a playbook terrorist tactics. While there are conflict pockets, it is also erroneous to portray the entire country as being engulfed in an all-out civil war. The Ethiopian government repeats that fear and panic mongering about the situation in Addis Ababa and the country is irresponsible and unnecessary. It is extremely disappointing that some key partners have been taking the lead here and also encouraging and mobilizing other partners to further intensify this rhetoric of doom. Creating an atmosphere of fear and insecurity for political purposes is squarely to be rejected. The government of Ethiopia has achieved decisive military victory over the terrorist group and regained control of areas, as has been witnessed over the past few days. Measures against the terrorist group will continue until TPLF no longer becomes a threat to the peace and security of the country. On commitment to accountability that has been taken by the federal government, it is to be recalled that last month, upon the joint investigation report issued by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights, the Prime Minister had committed to following up on the recommendations that were given in that report. And at that point had been announced that a joint ministerial task force would be set up for this purpose. In that regard, the Inter-Ministerial Task Force to oversee redress accountability measures in response to human rights violations committed in the context of the conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia has officially started its work yesterday. by adopting a comprehensive strategy and action plan for the implementation of the recommendations that had been provided within the joint investigation. So this strategy and action plan will cover all serious violations that have been committed in the context of the conflict. Mind you that the report is limited to the extent that it investigated only atrocities that had been committed prior to the unilateral humanitarian ceasefire being enacted. However, this strategy and action plan will also include those that have occurred in Afar and Amhara regional states after the ceasefire was declared by the federal government. To carry out its work, the task force has established 4 committees that will focus on investigation and prosecution. Second one to focus on refugees and internally displaced persons affairs. A third one looking into sexual and gender-based violence. And the last one on resource mobilization. The task force has directed the Committee on Investigations and Prosecutions to begin operationalizing a specialized joint civil-military investigation and prosecutorial unit with the requisite operational autonomy to ensure accountability through a transparent and robust legal process. Another part of today's briefing that I want to share in a little bit broader conversation is the disinformation campaign that continues being waged against Ethiopia by TPLF and also distributed by TPLF sympathizers. Firstly, there continues to be a purposeful disregard that the nation was pushed into this conflict by TPLF. This is an organization that has been the common denominator in 3 wars within the country over the past 30 years. It is designated a terrorist organization by the Ethiopian parliament. The US Homeland Security have previously indicated that TPLF qualifies as a Tier 3 terrorist organization. It has made alliances with other terrorist organizations operating in the country, and yet a democratically elected government is equated with a terrorist organization just because this particular clique may have best friends in hegemonic circles within the West. Secondly, I would like to highlight the distorted views being drawn from statements and news developed in the Amharic language. Many Western media are complicit in this, particularly in exaggerating issues based on erroneous translations. The recent erroneous reporting being made that media have been clamped down by the state of emergency from reporting on the conflict. This is purposeful disinformation. The state of emergency prohibits unauthorized entities from announcing battlefield or battlefront activities which have not been verified through the appropriate security sector channels. Thirdly, the purposeful crafting of the situation as genocide and as ethnic cleansing has been shaped over the past year to gain international sympathy for regime change efforts. To bring facts to the fore, the TPLF attacked Ethiopia's Northern Command, as we all recall, November 3rd, leading to November 4th. And by November 4th already, before even the National Defense Forces were mobilized to enter into the Tigray region for the rule of law operations that had been enacted, we would see that TPLF digital activists had already taken to Twitter to start shaping the narrative and declaring genocide. Now we see this through their foreign allies further shaping the narrative globally to facilitate intervention, while the war has not been in the region for 5 months now. And this is something that we want to reiterate again. The focus is still within a conflict in the Tigray region, whereas the National Defense Forces have actually vacated from the Tigray region as of end of June 2021. The war is now in the Amhara and Afar regions, and not enough attention is being paid in this regard. So if any entity is committing ethnic cleansing, it is the TPLF, as it has been sending human wave after wave into the Amhara and Afar regions to fight. And it's important to remind everyone here that TPLF is employing the same narrative tactics it employed in the 80s as it was trying to gain advances within different parts of the country, as well as the city. So the same playbook, if there's anybody who's interested in deep investigative reporting, you would see that it's a play-by-play tactic, particularly in terms of the psychological warfare and the propaganda that's being employed. The only difference now is that the advent of social media as a tool for propaganda and psychological warfare is being employed by this group. I would like to raise here a concerning trend we are also witnessing on social media platforms, on mainstream media, and also on academic circles, which is the silencing of pro-Ethiopia voices and the propping up of regime change and pro-TPLF narratives instead. On social media, particularly, we have reason to believe that Twitter is targeting and suspending pro-Ethiopia voices that are raising awareness about the TPLF's atrocities and its lies. We have shared this with their policy team, that we believe Twitter has been infiltrated by TPLF sympathizers in the same manner that many democratic institutions and corporate spaces have also been infiltrated to provide a TPLF narrative. On some mainstream Western media, we have, of course, seen the anti-Ethiopian government perspective dominate. Again, we have seen this trend before in many countries where media was used to effectively demonize governments and their leaders in order to facilitate regime change, and the same is playing now. We have seen academic circles in the West being co-opted to magnify TPLF as a victim narrative and shaping that narrative. And this is just the tip of the iceberg that we're sharing with you, but it's evidence that various democratic spaces are being captured to facilitate the ground for regime change under the pretext of humanitarian assistance, human rights, and democracy. We have seen this playbook in Libya and many other countries that have been destabilized purposely through these kind of overtures. A message to share for some members of the international community. There is no substitute for working with the sovereign elected government of Ethiopia. Any talk of an unelected and elite group's orchestrated transitional government or regime change is reckless and futile. The Ethiopian political system and the government offers, or the offer of a national dialogue, provides all the room that is needed to accommodate contestation with opposition groups. The space has opened up over the past 3 years and has remained as the go-to platform in order to do that, not necessarily through violent means. They cannot illegally and subversively contest the emerging democratic order. Again, another message is to seize the selective outrage. TPLF should not be positioned as a legitimate favorite because they once dominated the politics, that they once dominated the economy as well as the military of the country, and because they have laid out networks of convenience which are being employed in shaping a false narrative globally. They are still a terrorist organization to millions of Ethiopians, employing the same tactics that similar organizations in the international community has been fighting off in other parts of the world under the banner of national interest, democracy, and regional stability. A final call is being made to Ethiopians within the diaspora, and this is to continue raising your voices in a united manner as you have done so. There is a time and a place for ideological differences and opposition, and not at this point in time when the existence of your country is being tested by forces far and near. As the Ethiopian Christmas holiday is upon us, Ethiopians in the diaspora are being challenged to come home for Christmas, 1 million diaspora by January 7th, 2022. So with that, I will open it up for any questions that you may have on issues that have been raised. Let's start from this end. Grum. I'll come back to you. You can start with you, Grum.
Thank you so much, Belene. Groom CGTN. My question is on the humanitarian effort first. You've said that trucks are entering the Tigray regional state, but what about in the Amhara and Afar regional states? Because you've said that millions of people are in jeopardy now, in need of perhaps everyday food support for them to survive, and many others are also still falling into that kind of category. What needs to be done also from the international community to support the government in its effort of addressing the humanitarian situation in the other regional states, including Tigray as well? The other question is, war is continuing, as you've said. The government is not going to stop offensive until TPLF ceases to be a threat for the country, as per your statement. But is there any final slight chance for a peaceful resolution as per the pitch of the African Union? Thank you.
Thank you, Gru. Pertaining to your first question, I had highlighted a little bit some of the data that had been received from the National Disaster Risk Management Commission on updates with regards to humanitarian assistance for internally displaced people from the Amhara region, as well as those that are in need. And indeed, As I was elaborating earlier on, there is a misconception, still a misconception that exists that active combat is happening, or an active combat is happening within the Tigray region, which is not the case. The National Defense Forces have been outside of the Tigray region for the past 5 months. So a lot of the fighting is happening on the territory of the Amhara and Afar regions. A lot of lives have been lost within the Amhara and Afar regions. A lot of property has been looted, livelihoods that have been damaged as well, and has created a very strong insecurity within the region of Amhara and Afar regions. But there's not enough attention that is being paid from the international community. We are seeing particularly, an overabundant rhetoric coming back again and again, that assistance is only needed within the Tigray region, which is not the case. As I was just mentioning to you, about 5.6 million people within the Amhara region are affected as a result, as a direct result of TPLF's belligerence as well. So there are partners that are supporting within the Amhara region, but this needs to be really scaled up. The call for TPLF to cease its belligerence and its violence within these regions needs to be also called, because the silence is aiding and abating them, and further giving them ammunition in a way, because they are not being held accountable for the livelihoods that they're destroying and the lives that they're destroying. So that call is to ensure that there's enough focus on the need for humanitarian assistance within the Afar and Amhara regions as well. On your second question on the potential for peace, again, I reiterate that the federal government and the Prime Minister, the administration that he's been leading, the pathway to peace has always been there. The pathway to peace has been there from the beginning, as TPLF were drumming the war narrative before the altercation. The pathway to peace was there once it had been started. The pathway to peace was there when the humanitarian ceasefire was enacted. Several calls even before that for TPLF to surrender, for TPLF fighters to be given amnesty, and that the focus of the rule of law operations was only on seizing and apprehending the higher echelons of the TPLF and providing or giving amnesty for the rest of the fighters. The same call has been made today, but those calls are falling on deaf ears. And we hope that particularly, people within the Tigrayan community, in the diaspora, are also pushing for TPLF to cease and desist on this belligerent activities. But pertaining to particularly what you're saying with President Obasanjo's or former President Obasanjo's efforts, Ethiopia in principle still supports that process. This is something that we have been championing from the beginning, that it is being owned through an African process. His Excellency has been doing various consultations. He's been here, he's traveled to Mekelle, he's met with the higher leadership of the federal government, and these consultations will continue. But one thing that we have to emphasize is that one size fits all kind of solution does not work. From the beginning, we have been talking about context, because one of the clear things that the international or some sections of the international community keep making a mistake is that for them, Ethiopia, or the current issues in Ethiopia, began as of November 3rd, 2020. But there is context to that, context to the 3 years in which TPLF's tentacles were being laid, and the networks for what they were doing, for what they're doing right now, have been laid. The 27 years in which they had been ruling the country as well, and the destabilizing efforts that have ensued as a result of that. So, considering the complexity of the situation, you cannot bring a one-size-fits-all kind of solution and expect it to hold water. It cannot be something that's hastened. It has to go through its own process, and an Ethiopian process and an African process. But the potential for peace is something that the government is actively championing. Ravi?
You mentioned some of the measures carried out under the state of emergency. A number of groups, including the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, have voiced concern that arrests under the state of emergency have been carried out on the basis of identity. And there also have been some reports of violence against ethnic Tigrayans in parts of Wolo and in Bahir Dar. Is the government taking any steps to tamp down anti-Tigrayan sentiment, and is this something that is of concern to the federal government in the context of the conflict? And secondly, to come back to the pathway to peace, I hear you saying that a pathway to peace exists. At the same time, if I understand your comments, you're saying that the TPLF would need to surrender before talks could happen, or that pathway could be explored. Could you elaborate a bit on that? Is that really a requirement, or is there a scenario in which peace could be explored short of a surrender of one of the warring parties? Thank you.
Okay. On the implementation of the state of emergency, this blanket portrayal of anti-Tigrayan sentiment is erroneous, and it's a dangerous narrative. Again, something that's being perpetrated globally, because Tigrayans are not a homogeneous group, and to treat a group of people as a homogeneous group is really not understanding the context of the country as well. There are many apolitical Tigrayans that are within the country as well, that are part of the government too. There are TPLF sympathizing individuals. There are TPLF members that have been also, a part of the networks that TPLF has laid out that have infiltrated the cities as well throughout the country. So taking measures against particular TPLF operatives that have taken a mandate from the TPLF to destabilize need not be mixed with Tigrayans, and that anti-Tigrayan sentiment that you talk about, this narrative shaping, is really creating more problems because it's more narrative than it is actually reality. But in terms of any discrepancies that may arise with regards to the implementation of the state of emergency, the good thing is that a state of emergency inquiry board has been established, which is overseeing the application of the state of emergency and the implementation. So any complaints in how it's being implemented are raised to the state of emergency inquiry board, which will investigate and lay out the pathway to any rectifications that need to be made. I haven't stated about any conditionality to it. I had just given at the beginning context to why the counteroffensive was launched. The counteroffensive being the amp up rhetoric to siege Addis Ababa, to overthrow a democratically elected government, the continued killings that are happening in the Afar and Amhara regions by the TPLF. So at this point in time, a priority for the government of Ethiopia is to thwart off these threats. So alongside that, it doesn't mean that the processes for peace will not be laid out. We have talked before about national dialogue and the pipeline, the principles, the architecture, and the institutions that are being set up for that. So we should not think of it just in terms of a siloed approach, but confronting, the nation is confronted right now with an existential threat that it is attempting to adequately address. We'll go to this side, if any questions. Iskander.
Thank you very much, Bildani. Taking you to the point you alluded to earlier, it has been a week since the Prime Minister left for the battlefield to lead the army from there. How long will he be away from routine government business? And on the peaceful solution that you alluded to earlier, had there been any proposal presented to the government by the African Union High Representative Olusegun Obasanjo? Thank you.
Okay. Iskander, I can't really specify in terms of a timeline. There are a lot of victories that have been registered over the past few days. We expect some more over the next few days as well, so I cannot put a timestamp in terms of the Prime Minister's being at the forefront, leading the troops. With reference to the peaceful solution that you mentioned in terms of whether there is any kind of proposals that have been put forward, the representative of the African Union, His Excellency Olusegun Obasanjo, is still in consultations with different groups as well. So he will be returning. He's been coming and he's been going, talking to different stakeholders as well. So we imagine that on his next round that he would come with the proposals that would be conferred with the appropriate bodies within government. Okay, take one question from here.
Thanks, hi. You mentioned the movement of trucks into Tigray in the past week. My understanding was there hadn't been any going in since October the 18th. Could you explain why that is and what's changed to enable them to start moving again in the past week? You also mentioned foreign powers or foreign countries which are working with the TPLF to weaken and destroy Ethiopia. Could you specify which foreign powers you believe are are doing that? Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. The first question that you were talking about with the effect of humanitarian trucks not going in, it has been shared before as well. The belligerence of the TPLF, particularly on the corridor leading through to Afar and to the Tigray region, has been, I mean, you've noted over the past few weeks the attempts that the TPLF have been trying to make, or the advances they've been trying to make to choke off the corridor from the Afar region coming into the other parts of the country. So for the same reasons, there has been that skirmish, but now that the federal forces have been advancing and been clearing that area as well, it has opened up, and I think even USAID has attested to the fact that some of these trucks have started moving into there. On your second question, I don't need necessarily to specify it. I think the forces know who they are, so we'd leave it at that. Adra?
Thank you. So the areas, especially in Afar, that you mentioned have been taken, liberated by ENDF. What is the plan in place to return IDPs to their homes, like people who moved from Chifra or Kazagita or the other areas? If there is any plan in place to bring them back. The other one is, we have seen on different, I think, local stations on the treatment of fighters who were injured in action. What is the treatment that they have been given so far, and which organizations?
On the what? Sorry, I didn't hear the second part.
Fighters who were injured in the front lines. How is the treatment that they're being given, and what they're being provided with, and if there are any organizations that are helping and assisting in this area in addition to the humanitarian support that they've been giving.
Thank you, Adra. On your first question, I mean, this is still an active operation in so many of these areas. So while the priority at this point is thwarting off and pushing back the TPLF, the other work in terms of reinstituting or placing people back into their original locales is something that would be worked in the pipeline. I don't have any further details to give you other than that at this point in time. With reference to injured, who's taking care of them? Primarily the government of Ethiopia, primarily the Ethiopian people. If you've seen over the past weeks, over the past months, there is a strong drive rooted in the culture of Ethiopia to support each other. So you have communities, you have private sector, you have the government sector all coming together to respond to the needs of displaced people as well as persons that are also injured during combat. So I think I'll close it off at that, and we'll come back at another time with more updates. Thank you.